Welcome everyone to my presentation on challenges to the peace promoting objectives to KAZA TFCA. KAZA stands for Kavango-Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area, and before we go on I would just quickly want to just show you exactly where it is and what we're talking about. So on the left hand map you can see the big oval in the center. You can see all the red ovals are transfrontier conservation areas that have been established in southern Africa. The big one right in the center, that is KAZA. It's the biggest one to date to have been established. And you can see on the right-hand side where it is located. It actually includes parts of 5 different countries: Botswana, Namibia, Angola, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. And in area, it's roughly the size of France. It's a huge area. It encompasses a number of rivers. It's got 36 national parks. It's a very big biodiversity of animals. And as well as major tourist attractions like Victoria Falls, the Okavango Delta, Chobe National Park, the Zambezi region. So it's a well-known tourist destination as well. And the major draw card of KAZA is going to be that by taking down the international physical barriers on international borders, they hope to re-establish migration routes for elephants across all these different borders, and also for tourists to actually make it easy to follow these migrating animals across the borders, whereas before you would have to actually cross borders each and every time you try to do that. They are going to try and make that easy for the tourists to actually follow that. So that is sort of the plan for KAZA that was established in 2012. Now, the Peace Parks Foundation is heavily invested in the establishment of TFCAs in Southern Africa, and as the name already suggests, they envision that these transfrontier conservation areas, which by definition actually straddle international borders, will contribute to establishing peace between different nations that take part in such an international venture. International borders, traditionally, historically, are more often seen actually as places of conflict rather than peace. And for instance, 2 countries might actually have a conflict over where exactly the border should be situated, or a border might be a place from where a neighboring country or an insurgent group might actually invade your country. And the Peace Parks narrative actually tries to reconceptualize borders as opportunities for peacemaking. And the thought behind that is that by cooperating, different countries will actually have a joint interest in making it work, and this will encourage better relations. And as you can see, there's a list of proponents who are on board with this and who are also, having this narrative about peace building and establishing peace and how important that is. One important one among them is, for instance, SADC. Now, in the area of KAZA, there are a number of challenges to this peace-promoting objective of the Peace Parks Foundation. And critics have already pointed out that as much as it might be an incentive for countries to actually cooperate, it might also create discord between countries if you have to jointly manage such a very complex venture as KAZA. But apart from between states, contention might also arise between different stakeholders, for instance, between the government and between local communities and between foreign tourist investors and between NGOs that are in the conservation business. And they all have different priorities. NGO that looks at conservation will have very different priorities from a foreign company that wants to make money, and again, different from the local community that wants to actually safeguard its local livelihoods. So the potential for discord is very much there. And anecdotal evidence in the area, in KAZA area, suggests that there are 2 specific issues that might play a role in this sort of thing. And one is that you are talking about border populations. And in all 5 of those countries, between the border populations and the central government, the relationships have not been harmonious, not historically and not in current times. And usually this centers on matters of socio-economic deprivation. The other thing that also might become an issue is that there's a transnational poaching network already active and has been for a long time in that area. And this is going to be a big problem as well to resolve if this is going to be a major tourist attraction. This leads to the objectives that for both KAZA and the 5 member states, that they have to actually solve these problems, and this is where their interests very closely intersect. What what the 5 member states expects from KAZA is that the thinking goes that KAZA will bring tourists, and tourists will bring money and employment, and in this way their hostile border populations will be pacified. KAZA in turn looks to the 5 member states to provide the security and stability that is necessary to actually bring on all these tourists and the numbers that are needed to actually make a real difference in socio-economic circumstances. And in order to do that, the criminal networks need to be eradicated, and they're looking to the states to actually to provide that sort of security. Now, the case study for this paper is located in the Zambezi region, which was formerly known until last year as the Eastern Caprivi in Namibia, and it's there in the blue circle, so you can see it's actually very central in that whole area. And what I'm going to do is just quickly sketch the context as it was when KAZA was launched in 2012, what was going on then. And then after that, I want to look at what is happening, what is KAZA actually looking at when it has to address those twin objectives of poverty alleviation and when the KAZA member states have to actually eradicate those illegal networks that are active in the area. So just to start with the context, the relationship between what was the Eastern Caprivi and now the Zambezi region and the central Windhoek government has never been very close. It wasn't very close even during the War for Independence, when there was a separate political organization that became an armed organization that actually joined forces with SWAPO, coming from the main body of Namibia, but had a falling out even before independence, about 10 years, and a lot of the fighters, the freedom fighters from Kano, which was the Caprivi region, returned to the Zambezi region, even before independence. And as soon as independence arrived and there were elections, they went into opposition and they did not vote for SWAPO but for the opposition party. And that was the only place in Namibia where SWAPO did not win the election. The local residents tell you that to this day, SWAPO has not forgiven them, and they have been neglected by the central government in terms of employment, in terms of investment, in terms of services. And indeed, Zambezi region is the poorest region in Namibia with the highest incidence of HIV/AIDS, with the highest numbers of employment. So there is a real problem there. On top of all that, in 1999, 2000, there was an armed attempted secession where the Eastern Caprivi tried to become independent. It was very small, no one hardly knows about it, but they did try, and the Namibian government very quickly and ruthlessly put it down. The people who actually took part in this either went into exile, have been living in refugee camps in Botswana until very recently, and a number of them have been arrested and are in Windhoek in jail, and that process is still ongoing. People have actually died in jail and they still haven't had their day in court. So that's a contemporary and very, very contentious issue still ongoing to this day. That's very sensitive. The context on the transnational criminal networks, as I said, they are long-standing, actually started out in Botswana and Zimbabwe and have moved around. And these people who are involved actually operate all the way from Lusaka down to Kasane in Botswana. And it's a very well organized, sophisticated network, typically actually aims at ivory tusks, transports them up to Lusaka when they are taken either in Botswana or in Angola or the Caprivi region. In Lusaka, they cut into smaller pieces, they repackage, they send down by truck again to either Windhoek or to South Africa from where they shipped out. And it's a well-organized poaching syndicate, and problematically, there's heavy local involvement in all 5 of the countries of local communities that actually help along the route. Against this background, KAZA was proclaimed in 2012, and poverty alleviation was the big buzzword, and it was, from the start, the governments and also the Namibian government said, well, we are going to address poverty alleviation through tourism. And this was not a new idea. It is actually grounded in the CBNRM principle, community-based natural resource management. And I think a lot of you are familiar with this, but basically what it means is that the communities are invested in actually conservation, but are also, it's not a separate situation like Kruger National Park where wildlife and people are separated. The communities live in the land where the wildlife also is. So CBNRM has been active in the Zambezi region for 15 years almost, so we can look at them to see if they have actually made a difference, because KAZA has already said it will continue with CBNRM practices. And what we see is that it has not done very well. In fact, benefits do not reach the household level. Employment opportunities have not increased. On top of that, for the local people, the use of natural resources like hunting for the pot has been totally curtailed, so that they don't have that to fall back on in a lean year. And they suffer quite a bit of damage through wildlife. As the wildlife numbers are actually growing, now they're suffering more and more damage, and the compensation is not enough. Then there's another point, there's a lot of problems with that. One of them is, for instance, game fences will have to be removed when you want to establish migration routes. This will directly affect all the cattle farmers, because now they are vulnerable to diseases brought in, like foot and mouth disease from the buffalo, and they will not be able to command the same prices that they did before they export beef, or they might not be able to export at all. The fight against criminal networks. The region has seen huge militarization over the last years. There's an anti-poaching field force that works in tandem with the Namibian Defence Force, and a lot of cooperation, more and more, between the KAZA host states, which was very different from when KAZA was established, when at some point people from the region actually went on the river and they were shot from the other side by the Botswana Defence Force, who said that these guys were poachers, and they said, no, we're just, we were cutting reeds and we were fishing. Now, you see that even in Namibia, the police are actually petitioning the government to also be allowed to have shoot-on-sight policies like the Botswana Defence Force already has in the fight against poaching. Of course, the local communities are heavily affected by this, and because the law enforcement agencies, they know that the local people are involved in the poaching by, even hiding a tusk or maybe using manpower, typically taking the poachers across the rivers, because they know all the different ways to get across the river without being seen. So that is one problem, is that there's already been reports of police brutality in the villages, and also the traditional livelihood strategies of being on the river and fishing and hunting for the pot are being criminalized more and more. Of course, the KAZA recognizes this problem, and one of the things that they try to do is to actually designate the local communities as key stakeholders, so that they actually have a say in what is going to happen in KAZA. Unfortunately, when we look at what has been happening over the last 2 years, the findings are that there's a lack of local consultation, and the community, KAZA has actually made it a principle to approach the community through elites, but it's the very elites that actually earn from KAZA, and that money does not trickle down to the household level. So that is not working at all, and it is exactly the same problem with CBNRM. The consultations generally take place with people who are already on board with the whole KAZA thing, who already stand to earn from it, but not with the people who actually have problems and who cannot see how it must work and have problems with how it's going to affect them. And then the community input in the pre-feasibility study was not done at all. They had, in total, 276 stakeholders were interviewed, and those were lodges, and those were NGOs, and those were people from the government offices. Of all these 276, only 20 were actually local people from the 5 countries, local people actually living within KAZA. And when I took a closer look at those numbers, I saw that from the 26, 12 actually came from Namibia, but 5 of them worked for CBNRM. One was a lodge owner, and the others were all people in a position of authority that would actually earn from KAZA. So, as far as I'm concerned, no one was consulted at all, actually, in the pre-feasibility study. Where does that leave us? Looking historically, I would say the prospects for poverty alleviation are not very good. The militarization is creating distrust of law enforcement bodies where there was none before, and local communities are not being included in decision-making. So what I see at this point is that there is an increased harmony between the KAZA states at that level, but between the state and the border population, instead of resolving the issues that might have played and creating harmony, things are actually getting worse. Thank you very much.